Welcome to Unity Now, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Toby Davis. Today I have the distinct pleasure to speak with Amna Khalid. Amna is a professor of history at Carleton College, original creator of the Heterodox Out Loud podcast, and now host of the new podcast, Banished, which focuses on censorship and cancellations. Welcome, Amna.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're thrilled to have you today, and if you want, go ahead and fill in any of the blanks in the background that I might have missed there.
Well, for your listeners, it might be interesting to know that I'm originally from Pakistan, and that's where I grew up. I did my undergraduate degree in Pakistan. I moved to England to do my postgraduate work and was there for quite a few years. After I finished, I moved to South Africa, where I taught for 2 years at the University of Cape Town. And now here I am. I've been at Carleton College for the last 10 years. So that's my kind of trajectory to Minnesota.
Okay. And so you're, like we mentioned just a second ago, your new podcast is called Banished. Mm-hmm. And we have a couple episodes out now, and I think one sneak preview of some of your, one of your paid subscription sort of episodes, if I'm saying that right. Mm-hmm. And it focuses, like you said, on censorship and cancellations. Tell us how you got to this point. So if coming from Pakistan and those travels that you listed, how did you get to hosting this podcast? What brought out that idea?
So I'll tell you a little bit about my intellectual journey and why actually I came to the US, and that'll set us up for a conversation about how I got involved with Booksmart Studios, which is the production company that hosts Banished.
Great.
So as I said, I grew up in Pakistan, and from a young age, I think I've been quite inquisitive, curious, but also quite outspoken. And one of the things that bothered me at an early age in Pakistan was that even though I was raised in a fairly liberal atmosphere, culturally, socially, there are constraints to asking questions. And this was something that really interfered with my intellectual curiosity. And it really came to a head in my undergraduate years when I felt like I was at this seemingly liberal private university where I should be able to ask questions, where nothing should be off limits, but right. I found myself being constrained. And there were consequences. I saw my friends asking questions which were very quickly, at least by some people, seen as blasphemous or edging towards blasphemy. And in a country that has very strong blasphemy laws, which are punishable by death, those are scary moments to approach, to think about approaching conversations with those kinds of consequences. So as a result of that, and because I really did want to pursue the life of the mind, I decided to go for graduate studies to England. And one of the key things, I think, I was quite reluctant to come to the US initially, and this was back in the Bush era with the war on terror, which I had strong objections to. But at some point, I decided that it presented to me a freedom to express, a freedom to explore that really was, at least when I was growing up, was seen as the hallmark of the West, and particularly the Western Academy. So universities in Britain and in the US, in my mind, were places where you could ask questions and dare to go wherever your line of inquiry led you to. And that's really what informed my move to the US. And I was thrilled. I landed at a small liberal arts college, and in many ways it was a dream come true, and it still is. Only after a little while I started realizing that much to my chagrin, there was a way in which offense was becoming the language of, or was becoming a way in which the kinds of questions that could be asked were being constrained. So I first became aware of it when, as a professor, I had a student who came and asked me about trigger warnings, and I'd never heard about this term. And I was kind of taken aback, like, what is a trigger warning? And then, there was more and more started happening, and I started hearing about bias response teams and students being offended and dictating what are the kinds of topics that can and cannot be discussed, and what is the kind of tone of inquiry that can be used. So that was my introduction to the world of, disillusionment, if you will, my disillusionment with the Western Academy, which was, this is not what I was expecting. I was and to find that was being done in the name of progressive values was distressing to me. I mean, attacks on freedom of expression from the extreme right are not new, and those I was familiar with. And what surprised me was that these were coming from a different direction, a direction that I did not expect them from. Doesn't take away from the fact that there are still attacks on freedom of expression from the extreme right, and I'm happy to talk about that at length. But this particular moment was eye-opening for me, and that's when I started paying attention to the state of higher education in the US more broadly. And I came across Heterodox Academy, which I think does fantastic work in terms of bringing people together, professors mainly, but also administrators and increasingly graduate students, to fight against this new kind of orthodoxy that had established itself around 2016 in the academy, and where the freedom to question, the freedom for open inquiry had been limited. And so I came across Heterodox Academy and became a huge fan of their work, and have since then been following it. How I came to Banished is a slightly different story, but connected to Heterodox Academy. During my last year, I was a faculty fellow at Heterodox Academy, and during my work over there, it was through that I was approached by Booksmart Studios, by the two producers, Mike Volo and Matthew Schwartz, and they had seen some of my work, read some of the pieces I'd written, and they asked me if I'd be interested in hosting a podcast. And the more they talked to me and I talked to them about what are the kinds of questions that were weighing on my mind, we decided that the line of inquiry really should be trying to have more nuanced conversations about this move to cancel people, and simultaneously the move that is coming to censor things, both things that are troubling me a lot at this point in time. So that's the background to Banished, and now it's live, so we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, and then we've both at our podcast, we've taken a listen to the little bit of the first couple episodes, and you're covering great topics and things that it's surprising to hear some of the cancellation stuff that goes back even much farther than what we're experiencing today. Probably a lot of people might stop and say, well, all this started in the last few years, but not so much, right?
No, I think the impetus to cancel or to censor is as old as human communities are.
Right.
When we don't like something, our knee-jerk reaction is to try and cut it out. And that's understandable. But that's precisely exactly why we need to work extra hard not to do that, because once you start doing that, you rob yourself of the opportunity to really hear other points of view. And you run the risk of drowning in an echo chamber and hearing only that which appeals to you, which fundamentally is anti-intellectual. And it stops you from learning, which stops you from growing as a human being.
Right. And if you don't mind, I'd like to go back for a second. You mentioned the anti-blasphemy laws in Pakistan.
Or the blasphemy laws. Yeah.
The blasphemy laws. Right.
Yeah.
So could you describe some of those for our listeners and viewers? I'm not familiar with those, and I'm sure most people listening to our podcast might not be either. Can you
Sure.
detail some of that?
the kind of political ideology of Islam, of Pakistan is it's religiously based, it's grounded in Islam, and Islam as a religion, it has many diverse manifestations, but unfortunately the one that dictates the legal system in Pakistan when it comes to blasphemy is the Sharia law, which is the more kind of extreme version or manifestation of it, whereby if you say anything blasphemous which is against the honor of Prophet Muhammad, then you're liable to be stoned to death. And just recently, actually, it was reported that the most recent accusation of blasphemy has been leveled against an 8-year-old boy in Pakistan. And this
Wow.
This is in the international press as we speak. I haven't been following the case incredibly closely, but the news has just broken. And what's happened is that over the history of the country, this law has been used for political ends and has often been used to marginalize minorities within Pakistan, religious minorities, where we're talking about Christians and we're talking about Hindus. And with any such law that is so didactic, it lends itself to be used as a political tool to silence those who dissent, who show any kind of disagreement or dissent from the orthodoxy that is dominant in a society.
Wow, that's certainly troubling, and I'm not necessarily all that surprised. I figured you would say something along those lines. And to go back to your story and your travels to the podcast Banished and what you're talking about now, the word, I've heard words like contextualize a lot in your first episode of Banished, and it's like we've spoken to people like you at the podcast. One guest was Desh Amelia, who produced the documentary Better Left Unsaid. He came from Sri Lanka, a country rattled with civil war, and so he grew up and was born into true civil war. And then we talk about the perspective of where America is now, and are we headed for civil war, or are we right on the cusp of it? And so it seems like you offer some of that same perspective in the cancel culture and censorship now in America, and you're helping to offer that perspective and contextualize what we're seeing now. Is that a good way to put that?
I think so, and I'd like to say a couple of things here. The one thing is, I think what's happening in the U.S. Is not unprecedented, and it's also not new. And I think the U.S. could learn a lot from looking across the pond to the rest of the world. This is one of the problems, perhaps, that I feel in public discourse in the U.S. is that American exceptionalism has turned into this kind of navel gazing and almost an aversion to looking abroad for examples or for precedent of how things have played out. We could learn a lot from just having a more global perspective. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing that I find current political discourse is very ahistorical. There is a way in which even America's own history is something that isn't engaged with in a deep and meaningful way. Part of the problem, I'd argue, as a historian, part of the problem I feel right now in the kind of conversations around censorship and cancel culture is precisely that we're projecting the values of today onto the past and then evaluating people and texts and historical movements by those values. And that kind of presentism is a result of a lack of familiarity with history and a lack of understanding of context. So we've become a deeply literal-minded society, which is unable to appreciate that everything has meaning within the context of which it occurs. So that's one piece that I'd say. But I also want to be very careful here, and say that I'm drawing comparisons. I'm not in any way implying that in the US, we're at the place where, or in a place that is similar to the blasphemy situation in Pakistan. I recognize that there is still a world of difference. So I don't want to flatten that difference. Yet I want to say that what I find myself feeling in this moment in the US, the feeling that I have sometimes when I hear about what's going on is very similar to the feeling I would have then. So I'm not trying to equate the situations. But I am trying to say there are similarities, nor am I terribly concerned that tomorrow we're going to have blasphemy laws in the US. I don't think we're onto that path yet. I'm not scared about that. But I do find that there is a strange kind of inversion that is happening. I remember, I speak of this with my friends. I came of age in the era when Salman Rushdie's satanic verses was there was a fatwa against it, and there was a price on his head. And at that point, I remember the response of the West, which was very inspiring for people like me, which was that, no, they stood up for freedom of expression. And the idea that Muslims were offended, and not all Muslims were, but that some Muslims were offended, was not seen as a stringent argument to suppress speech and expression. And yet today I find myself, I'm having this moment of cognitive dissonance where I'm like literally right here where the freedom of expression is enshrined in the constitution of the country. And yet I find people using offense as a means to shut down conversation. And that to me is troubling. And it goes against what I had understood this country to stand for. So there are those moments where these things rub against each other. And I do feel that there are parallels to be drawn. They're not identical, but there are parallels to be drawn, which are instructive and can help us kind of pass out this moment and find a way forward.
Okay. So on the flip side, if you were to let's play the straw man's argument a little bit. When is this acceptable? When is censorship acceptable? Take a scenario like if Big Tech had shut down the social media site Parler before the January 6th riots had occurred, maybe that group would not have had the opportunity to organize. Is something like that scenario, is that acceptable to censor that
there
platform?
Are a couple of things here. I think hindsight is always 20/20, right? So it's always easy to say that if this had happened, that may not have happened. But that is actually doing history the wrong way. We do not know what would have happened. We don't do history by counterfactuals. So that's just the first thing, is we don't know what would have happened. Mm-hmm. But now coming to the question of when is it okay to cancel or to censor? And you're using the example of Big Tech. Honestly, I don't think I have it figured out. I'm not sure what the best strategy in that case is. It's also a situation where how the First Amendment applies is very different. It's not censorship from the state. We're talking about Big Tech and the legal. I don't think the legality is entirely clear over there. And if it is, I'm not up to speed on it to speak about it. But from a social point of view, I'm not sure. I think part of what I'm trying to do is have intelligent conversations about this so that we can find a way forward. I don't have it all figured out in the context of Big Tech. I do think I err on the side of not censoring in general, because I think that's usually shuts down conversation. In general, I'm much more in favor of having conversations, and I'm far more comfortable speaking about what the parameters of exploration should be on a college campus. As an academic, I feel very strongly about protecting academic freedom of both the faculty and the students in the context of learning, because that's where I think that censorship and banning and shutting down conversation is deeply harmful. The whole point of an education is to explore. So I'm much more at ease. I feel like that's the area where I've figured out more about what should and shouldn't be shut down.
That makes sense. And it is tough to try to wrap your head around Big Tech and censorship in that space. And also the access to information. It's mountains of data, right, that we're talking about when we bring that up. So your experience is more like in your first episode, you speak about artwork at I think it's a grade school in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken.
That's
and
right.
That's probably easier to wrap your head around, but it's also then you can contextualize it as well, or not, depending on what we're talking about. So in that instance, you're talking about a very specific work of art and what it was meant to be or what it was not meant to be and what the feelings are around it.
Yeah, and I think, I will say, I think we are in uncharted waters, because social media is a relatively new phenomenon, and it's a process of figuring out how those means of communication should be controlled, what those parameters should be. So I do think it's a moment where we have to. These are big questions, and we're still exploring, and we're still figuring those out. So it's not easy to have a straightforward answer to that. And I'd be skeptical. My stance is that if someone says they've got it figured out, I'm skeptical of that, because I want to know more about how and why. I don't yet think we're in a moment where we can have any kind of consensus or anything that even approaches a consensus on that issue.
Sure. Yeah. And I think skeptical is probably the right mode to be in. And yet you're right. Is there truly ever an expert on anything? I doubt it. And I don't even like that word because of that, the connotation it brings in, that's somebody who knows everything about a certain subject. How is that ever true with how much information there is out there?
Yeah, to my mind, an expert isn't someone who knows everything about a subject. It's someone who is willing to learn a lot about a subject and knows more than most people about a subject, and has explored that. So I would approach it a little differently.
Okay.
To me, an expert is someone who spent some serious time thinking about a subject and engaging in it. Nobody knows everything, and anybody who claims to know everything, I mean, that's a really ridiculous kind of claim, to know everything. But someone who has thought deeply about those issues and can have an informed point of view is someone that I would consider an expert.
Yeah, maybe that's a perception issue with myself, and how I perceive that word when it's brought up. So good point, fair. Along the lines of school boards and their decisions, and I can't imagine being in a school board right now in these times, especially with COVID going on. So along those lines, I'll tell everyone here about a scenario that popped up yesterday here in my hometown. So my kids go to a very rural school. It's a small county in Indiana. It's Mount Vernon School. And I can say that because you'll see it online. And there was a school board meeting a couple days ago. And there was a doctor present at the meeting who chose to share what he thought was the truth about a lot of things around mask wearing, about vaccines, ivermectin. He mentioned a lot of these buzzwords you hear now shared as the truth. And a lot of our viewers and listeners will have known about a lot of this from Brett Weinstein and the Dark Horse podcast. And the 15 minutes of that portion of the 1.5 hour long video got clipped, and it basically went viral, at least in Indiana, but there was also some national recognition. And YouTube's quickly moved to block that clip. Now, they didn't remove the entire school board meeting from YouTube, but they blocked that clip multiple times, shared by multiple people. And so then you have the perception of, from maybe people that are more right-leaning, especially in this county, that he was telling the truth and YouTube blocked it. And they didn't even get to see the school board's reaction, which in this case was very reasonable. And they're choosing to kind of hold their vote on different things and listen to all the perspectives of the parents, which I applaud them for doing. But then the reaction on the other side is, this guy is sharing false information, and we should block him, and he should be censored, and he shouldn't be allowed to speak at other board meetings. And I think I've heard he's going to speak at another local school board meeting here in a couple of days. So what a phenomenon there. And, why would you want to work, be on a school board right now? It's got to be difficult. Like you talked about the school board voting to censor the artwork in San Francisco.
Well, I don't want to be in a school board right now. I'll say that. I can't speak specifically to this particular situation because I don't know enough about it. I also can't speak to YouTube's banning of that clip because that is a private company choosing to do something. I will, however, say that there's something to be said. What I have a problem with is things being decontextualized and being, aired without context in general. I think that makes for bad discourse because you don't know what context it's been said in. In terms of, I feel like you're asking me in some ways what I think about people presenting what they think the truth is about the vaccine or COVID, which the broader consensus is not in line with? Is that the question?
I guess I was just thinking out loud about this situation that just happened to pop up here locally, and has relates to censorship on YouTube versus with this subject, and relates to school boards. So I don't think I actually asked a question, so it's not fair to say that you should respond to that necessarily. You certainly don't have to. We can get back to the Banished podcast.
What I will say is that I don't want to be on a school board right now. I don't envy people who have to navigate these conversations. I also think, I'm very much anti-censorship, but I think it bears, mentioning that not all ideas are equal, which means that certain, so when we talk about a lack of censorship, it doesn't mean that all and every idea needs to be aired and needs to be given airtime and discussed. There's certain things that particularly academic communities and communities of researchers broadly agree upon, and there are debates within those fields, and there's no such thing as there's always debate and always discussion, but there is a process of peer review within academic fields, medicine being one of them, and science being one of them. And there is a conception, I think there's a public perception, that science has everything figured out. And there is this truth out there that yes and no is the answer to that. Paradigms shift even within scientific knowledge. Having said that, there is a process through which certain ideas gain more credence than others. And that is precisely because experts sit together, debate, confer, and decide that certain ideas have more merit than others. So I think sometimes there is a tendency amongst people to think that if one is anti-censorship, it means that one says all ideas are equal and of equal value and must be discussed and debated equally. I think that is wrong. I don't think that is the way to approach a conversation if you want to have a meaningful conversation.
True. Right. Exactly. So like when Trump is saying stuff like, ingesting bleach will help you fight COVID, that's a great example of not all ideas deserve airtime, and, censorship of such idea is probably merited.
Well, it depends on who's doing the censoring, but yes.
True. Very good. So what are your thoughts on the school board in San Francisco? And they're on your first episode of Banished, you talk about the school board's decision to take down the murals in this school, which is then it's fought off. That decision is fought off in court by the Alumni Association, I believe.
Correct.
But it's got to be hard, like you said, and I said, it's got to be hard for that school board listening to these parents and or these children and their emotions, and they're feeling hurt. They're feeling that this is a negative portrayal, something they should not have to stare at every day.
I'm actually glad you asked that question, because it leads into a broader conversation about what I think the role of leaders in the educational realm ought to be. I do not want to deny anyone's hurt, and I'm not going to contest it. People can be hurt. I feel for them. I think I'm sorry when people are hurt. I genuinely am. But whether that should become a basis for painting over a mural or not trying to understand something in the context that it was produced in and what it is trying to convey, those are other questions, right? Many people can be offended. Where do you draw the line? People can be offended by anything. And tomorrow parents or students might say they're offended by X, Y, or Z. My question is, would the school board have responded differently if white students had come up and said they wanted this mural painted over because it's depicting George Washington in a light that offends them? I wouldn't be in favor of that either, right? So the question is, so just to give your listeners a little bit of context about these murals were painted in the 1930s by Victor Arnautoff, who was an immigrant to the US. He was an artist. It was part of the federal project to fund art during the Great Depression. And it's at these murals, there are 13 paintings massive paintings on the walls of George Washington High School, which is a school in San Francisco. And it's called The Life of Washington, the entire series. And it depicts Washington's life. And as part of the depictions, there are scenes which portray one dead Native American lying on the ground, as Washington is pointing westward to signify the westward expansion. And there are a couple of other images where African Americans are portrayed as picking cotton and doing, menial tasks on the plantation at Mount Vernon. And so some of the students were very critical, and this is not a new controversy. This happened back in the 60s already. There were students who were upset by these depictions. Now, the whole point over here is that Arnatov was making these murals, had put these on the wall precisely as a critique of the way in which history was being taught.
Right.
Which is that these people were not being recognized. Their exploitation and their contributions were not being recognized. So in a way, what Arnatov was doing back in the 1930s was taking federal money, putting murals that were very critical. Murals by nature, public art, is a form of public art which is critical of often political regimes. And what he was doing was showing the middle finger to the government and saying your curriculum isn't teaching history right. So he's on the side of those who were being marginalized.
Right.
Now, today, to see those depictions and say these are offensive to us shows to me, I don't contest that they're offensive. Again, like I said, I cannot contest that someone is hurt by them. But what I do strongly believe in as an educator, our role as educators is to empower our students to get beyond the hurt, to understand, and to rise above it, to transcend it, so that they can face difficulty in life, not to shut out the difficulty and to coddle them. But I think the idea is to help our students cope and to thrive in the real world, and to give them the tools that are necessary to deconstruct these situations and move forward. The school board. I think the school board needs to prioritize what their mission is, which is an educational mission. I think we can both recognize that people have an emotional response and yet help them deal with it. We do not renege on our responsibility to educate. So to my mind, the school board needs to uphold those. I think the school board can do a lot to do both things. It can recognize and at the same time contextualize these murals by putting up plaques that explain the history of these murals. In fact, that was a promise the school board had made back in the early 70s when the response murals by Dewey Crumpler, an African-American artist, were put up on the walls. And it was a promise that they made, but that they never kept. So instead of thinking about spending somewhere close to $750,000 to cover these murals, why not contextualize them and use them as an educational tool, which in my mind as an educator is the most obvious thing to do.
Right. And I think the short answer, and maybe an oversimplified answer, is the knee-jerk reaction, like you said, that is the same thing that it has us bringing down statues all across the country in the last couple of years, right? So it's something that's become, the thing to do, right? And it's almost like it's okay culturally now because it's spreading around. You're seeing it here, you're seeing it there, you're seeing the changing of major sports teams' names because of the offense it brings to these marginalized groups. So it's got to be hard to fight back against that cultural norm these days in a little bit, right?
I'm sure it is hard to fight back. I think, again, like all these controversies you've raised, the context is different. With statues, the context is slightly different, and we need to understand it in that realm. But overall, I'd say, in general, I think we would be far more productive in moving the conversation forward if we didn't just ban things or remove things, but created responses to them and put up more responses from different perspectives that generates conversation. As a historian, I approach many things, for us, many things are primary sources. We see them as objects or texts to be studied. They tell us something about the time in which they were put up, and I think there are some monuments are very, very problematic in that they have stood for certain things or certain ideas that we find morally reprehensible today. And I think that needs to be noted. I think you can put up plaques around, you can contextualize them, you can have responses that trouble those assumptions that were at play when those monuments were put into place. But in general, I think, again, like I said, each of these things would have to be discussed individually. In general, my position is not to destroy, but to generate more.
Yeah, and I think that it's present in your second episode where you speak, with Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple. I don't want to give away all of your episodes. I want people to go listen to the episodes. But what can you tell us about that conversation and what led you to speaking with her? You gave us a little bit of the preview before we started recording.
Sure.
Right?
Well, Alice Walker, I thought, would be an ideal person to speak to our moments of censorship and cancellation, because she wrote The Color Purple. It came out in the 1980s, and when it did, it made a huge splash. She won the Pulitzer Prize for it. She was the first Black woman to win a prize for a piece of literature.
Right.
So in many ways, it shot her into the limelight and international fame. But simultaneously, she was shunned by many within the Black community who were not happy about the depictions of Black men or Black families that she had, the ways in which she'd portrayed Black families in the book and then subsequently the film. And so she really was, targeted by the community. And to navigate those moments when you are both being shot into the limelight for something that you've written that is being seen as shedding light on some really, hidden and perhaps interesting aspects of the Black community, while simultaneously trying to connect them to the broader human experience. So you're being celebrated for that at one end, and it's simultaneously being shunned for it by people within your own community. I think she navigated that in times way before, this is in the 80s. This is well before what we see as the rise of cancel culture today. So getting that historical perspective of what that experience was and what she learned from it, I thought would be a very interesting conversation. And so we talked about that. And through that experience, I was eager to hear her thoughts on how she sees this particular historical moment and the ways in which cancellations are on the rise and censorship is on the rise. And I found it to be a heartening conversation because she helped me in particular zoom out a little bit and think about that this is not a new phenomenon. It happens, and this is not to say we don't need to resist it, but there is hope that this too shall pass.
Yeah, and I think I find that a lot of times, you mentioned before we started that, a lot of times you feel despair, and maybe it's, maybe it's just that your attention to all of this is such a high level, and we feel that a lot as well on this podcast. I spoke with Dr. Edward Watts, who authored The Fall of the Roman Republic, and he talks about the comparisons between the Roman Republic and America and our republic. And I asked him point blank, I said, is there going to be a podcast in 500 years talking about the fall of the U.S. Republic? And he said, I don't think so. And he gave context behind that, and it was heartening to hear answers like that, and we repeatedly hear answers from guests like that. Are you hoping that you highlight instances like this like you've done with both of these episodes, but are you hoping to heal that divide and hope to bring that heartening moments to each episode potentially?
I really don't know what I'm hoping to do, and I wouldn't claim to say that I have any delusions of being a healer. What I really just want to do is have meaningful conversations and to try and bring different perspectives, shed light on, bring different perspectives to shed light on any kind of controversial issue that we're facing in the realm of censorship and cancellation. I hope that we can get to a point where we have more informed conversations. I think that is my primary aim in Banished, is to try and open up the space where instead of reacting to things, we are processing things and engaging in robust, informed conversation that allows people or opens up the room for people to think. I'm not even there to change people's minds per se. I'm not trying to say, I know what to think and this is what you need to do. I truly, genuinely want genuine conversations where we can dig into matters more deeply and talk about them without feeling the need that we need to take a position instantly. Part of the problem, I think, and I say, I think I can say this coming from the outside, it's very starkly visible to someone who comes from outside the US, is that every issue in the US is so hyper politicized. And it's this binary, you're either on the left or you're on the right, you're either Democratic or you're Republican. And I find that, from issues that I never thought could be politicized, positions on things that I think should be the subject of debate and discussion amongst experts within a field suddenly becomes a point of an area of taking a position, a political position. It gets associated with a political position. And that to me it truly is mind-boggling. Like, why are we in a moment where we feel that our sense of who we are politically must feed into how we take a position on everything? And so there is a tribalism that I find at play. And I find it to be there's something very particular that's happening in America at this moment, I should say. I don't want to say it's American because I don't think that's always been the case, but it's something very particular to this moment. And it troubles me because it, again, is going against the very basic need for us all to engage in thinking. If your positions on issues are predetermined, then you're never truly engaging intellectually. And that means you've turned off some of your critical faculties, much to your own detriment.
Right. And that's, everything you said there is entirely why we're even speaking now. It's why I try to make the color behind me purple, between red and blue, and that's why the color of the podcast is purple. We're trying to show that the truth is really in the middle, and that there are more things that are true about all of us than what is not true about us. There's more that brings us together than divides us. And, if you're, like you said, if you're staunch in your position, if you're not willing to have a debate, a discussion, or just be open-minded and listen to differing opinions, you've already made up your mind, then you're probably already in a team. You probably identify as left or right, red or blue. And like you said, every position every decision, every position you have on any topic is going to be come from the perspective of that team. And you may not even, if you sat down and thought about it, you may not even agree with that position, but you have to vote that way. You have to think that way because it's your team's position, and we have to, above all else, we have to beat the other team.
Yeah, and that's not a good way to conduct a social life as a society or as an individual or a community.
And that reminds me, I wanted to ask you, in your email signature, I love the line at the bottom where you say, I'm not a person of color, I'm a colorful person.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
That comes from an aversion to labels. And it comes from this tendency, again, kind of an aversion to tribalism.
Right.
So that's part of it. I find the category people of color a very strange and totalizing category that flattens all differences within what are categorized as people of color. I also feel that people of within people of color, and I'm not just talking about individual communities like blacks versus Indians versus, and by Indians I mean Indians from my part of the world, or indigenous people. Like, no community has a monolithic experience, and no or a point of view. There is much diversity within these communities, and I find it patronizing to be lumped as a person of color in this category with all these people. I think it's a denial of individuality, of who people are truly. So, to my mind, people of color glosses over our differences. It creates a false binary between white people and people of color, which frankly is, I find, very meaningless. I think there are many, many other aspects of identity that inform who you are, and race is just one of them. And even yeah. I'll stop there, and then you can ask further questions. But it's really an aversion to labels. I think labels really flatten out peculiarities and differences, and also commonalities, and the fact that you can have commonalities with groups that you don't, that people might not see you as naturally affiliating with. There's a great book by Irshad Manji called "Don't Label Me," which I recommend highly to your readers, which kind of goes into what the problems with such labels is.
Don't label me?
Don't label me. That's right.
Okay. We actually started a book club series on the podcast, so we'll add that to the list.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. So what else do you have coming down the road if you want to preview anything for the Banished podcast? Do you have anybody you want to talk about you're going to speak to, or situations, to gloss over?
Sure. We're certainly going to be discussing the kind of fast proliferating anti-critical race theory bills that are coming.
Wow.
So we're going to be having a conversation about those, and bringing some interesting voices to reflect on what the impact of such moves would be on open inquiry and learning. Definitely going to be doing an episode where I hope to be speaking to John McWhorter about, what are the origins of terms like woke and cancel culture, and one that has become quite a cliche now, which is problematic. So kind of just discussing the origins of those. And then as we move on, I'm hoping to have some conversations on the move to either cut out the Western canon in the teaching of literature in K through 12 and more broadly in college as well, or to kind of, to basically push out what is seen as the Western canon in the name of bringing in more diverse voices that speak to students from different demographic sections of the population. So those are some of the things that we'll definitely be delving into more.
Okay. What other projects do you have? I bet you have a few, right?
What other projects do I have?
Yeah.
I mean, I am a professor, so one of my big projects is teaching, and
Sure.
I'm very closely involved with. Once term starts, there's a lot of time that I spend with my students. In addition to that, I have recently been paying attention to a lot of the ways in which anti-racism and diversity trainings are playing out on college campuses, particularly. So I've been reading and writing about that quite a bit. And those are the key areas that are occupying my attention right now. I would like to, I do specialize in the history of medicine and history of South Asia. And at some point I would like to return to some of my research over there. But I think we're in a moment when there's some really pressing questions that need to be addressed. And I am interested in doing more publicly facing writing and scholarship so that we can try and have those conversations with more information and more nuance.
If I could, I did want to let you go before asking you about, your time at the college there. How is that going? Are you seeing any of the things we talked about tonight, the things you just touched on that you're speaking out about? Are you troubled by anything going on there, or have they stayed out of any of that?
My time at Carleton College has been wonderful. And on the whole, I'd say, I've things at Carleton are not as bad as there are at other places. But Carleton, too, is working within a certain context. There's certain ideas and movements that are proliferating across campuses across the nation. So we are not immune to those. Certainly after the murder of George Floyd, there is increasing attention to racial equity, as there should be. I think Carleton is contending with some of those issues. However, much like other colleges, I think, it's a trial and error process. And there are certain times when they haven't quite figured things out. I hope that we will, together as a community, college community, find ways to address those things. And, these are, again, uncharted waters. So some of these things will take a little time to figure out. But on the whole, I'd say my experience at Carleton has been fantastic, and it's been a very supportive community.
Wow, that's great to hear. How, do you have any insight, do you think, on how they're able to maintain that kind of culture right now? With so much pressure from the outside, like you talked about.
Overall, I'd say Carleton's done a good job of protecting academic freedom. I think for any institution that wishes to model a way forward, that is vital, and Carleton's done a fairly good job at it. I think there are times when the institution could do more, as any institution could. But I think the most vital thing that I would stress for any educational institution is to protect the academic freedom of their faculty and their students. That should never be up for grabs in terms of being compromised for any other value. It takes precedence. And if you allow for the academic freedom of faculty and students to be preserved, you'll find that you'll have a proliferation of ideas and new ways of moving forward in difficult times. So that's the if there's a takeaway, I'd say institutions of higher learning can do in general a better job of valuing academic freedom, protecting it, and of modeling what we're in the business of, which is education. So tragically, I find many institutions are pandering to student demands, much like the corporate model, where the customer is always right, and if the student wants something, you give it to them. We need to remember that we have a mission, which is to educate, and we're not in the business of pandering to every demand that comes our way.
Right. And again, touching on your episode with Alice Walker, again, and all of that, I was shocked to hear, honestly. I had no idea any of that happened. So a great episode, number one. Number two, like you touched on her experience, sure she did, about kind of being canceled right before she was going to speak at a college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think when we take away people's opportunity to talk, we are really robbing ourselves of the opportunity to listen and learn something. It's important to even listen to things you disagree with. In fact, I'd argue it's even more important to listen to things that you disagree with.
Oh, but so hard, right?
Indeed.
Okay. Well, we can send people to booksmartstudios.org. Is that right?
Yeah, booksmartstudios.org. And Banished is one of the podcasts in the suite. There are two others. One is by Bob Garfield. It's called Bully Pulpit. Okay. And the other is by John McWhorter. It's called Lexicon Valley. So your listeners can check those out.
Okay, great. Well, we certainly appreciate your time tonight, and we know you're very busy, obviously, with everything you listed there. And, the podcast is great, and we encourage people to check out Banished. And they can get it on, what is it, Spotify?
On
and
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, really anywhere that you subscribe to your podcasts.
Okay.
And for those of you who are interested to be a paying subscriber, they get subscriber-only content, paying subscriber-only content as well.
On the website, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll send everyone there. And Amna Khalid, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you,
appreciate
Toby.
it.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Okay. See you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you for watching the Unity Now podcast. We'll be back with another conversation that highlights the political middle ground to unite Americans and end the ideological war. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and hit that subscribe button. Bye.